It's my deep pleasure to introduce Dr. Pankhurst. Dr. Pankhurst is a social anthropologist and the Ethiopia country director of Young Lives, an international study of childhood poverty. His role involves coordinating Young Lives research work in Ethiopia and leading on topics including urban relocation, child work, early marriage, and violence against children. Dr. Pankhurst is a graduate of Oxford University and has an MA and PhD in social anthropology from Manchester University. He taught for 16 years at Addis Ababa University as an associate professor, and he worked in the Wellbeing in Developing Countries project at the University of Bath, and is also a lead researcher for WIDE, W-I-D-E, a longitudinal study of community change in rural Ethiopia. His research interests include migration and displacement, poverty and well-being, community change, food security and social protection, and children and youth development. He has co-edited books on migration development, marginalized minorities, customary justice, natural resource management, and food security and social protection. You can see he is truly an esteemed scholar, and what an honor it is to have Dr. Pankhurst here with us. He has been involved in policy dialogue on child marriage, FGM, early childhood and youth development, and he's a founding member of the Child Research and Practice Forum and board member of the Ethiopian Society of Sociologists, Social Workers, and Anthropologists, and finally, board chair of the Forum for Social Studies. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alula Pankhurst.
Your Imperial Highness, Prince Hermias, Your Imperial Highness, Princess Saba, distinguished members of the Royal Ethiopia Trust, distinguished guests, it's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here in this wonderful room and to have had the privilege to visit this extraordinary exhibition of Ethiopia at the Crossroads. I am so glad that you have given me this opportunity to say a few words about the extraordinary shield, very beautiful shield that has been rescued from going into private ownership and will be restituted and repatriated to Ethiopia, and to contextualize that within the context of the Magdala British expedition of 1868. እንደምን ዋላችሁ ወገኖቼ፣ እዚህ በመገኘቴ በጣም ደስ ብሎኛል። So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of the context about the expedition that the British undertook and Emperor Theodorus's suicide, and then a little bit more about the history of restitution to date, starting with the imperial period, and going on to the association called AFROMET, the Association for the Return of the Magdala Ethiopian Treasures, and what has happened recently in a new phase related to auctions. And then I'll come to the shield to try and give you a sense of how it compares with other shields that were taken from Magdala, and in particular, the connection with Lady Mew. So, the British expedition of 1868 was instigated by Emperor Theodorus's attempt to have good relations with Queen Victoria, and receiving no response to his letters of requests, he held the missionaries and other Europeans captive, and a punitive expedition was launched with troops coming from India, and you can see the elephants on this. You can't see it, but and here the Amba, the top of the mountaintop, has been burnt after the capture of Magdala. Now, some interesting new findings are coming out about Emperor Theodorus and his suicide. We know that he committed suicide with a pistol. He shot himself through his mouth. And the American explorer Stanley of Dr. Livingston, I presume, fame, in his book about the expedition Kumasi to Magdala, suggested that Emperor Theodorus had actually shot himself with the pistol that Queen Victoria sent him, on which is a label saying, "In gratitude for your kindness to our servant Plowden." Plowden was the consul who had very good relations with Emperor Theodorus and sadly was killed in Ethiopia, and his death was avenged by Emperor Theodorus. But a new story has come up, and you can't see very much of it because of the automatic writing there, but another pistol is in the Geographical Society in Rome, and I had the chance to go and see it. And this pistol, according to Conti Rossini, was used by Emperor Theodorus to shoot himself. And that pistol had been sent by Napoleon III. And you can see, I can't see, I have the pictures here of Napoleon III, whose representative Lejean came and brought the pistol and gave it to Emperor Theodorus. And then Emperor Menelik is said to have given the pistol to King Umberto of Italy, which sounds like a very strange story, but it looks like some elements of that story are actually true, because the Italian explorer Antinori writes to King Umberto saying, "Here is the pistol that I am giving you." Now, recently, there has been a question of, in museums, the keeping of human remains. And the National Army Museum in London had a lock of hair of Emperor Theodorus, along with a letter that was, you can't actually see it there, but which was on display. And the Minister of Culture, Professor Hirut, visited and said, you shouldn't really be keeping human remains on display, and they should be restituted. And her successor, Dr. Hirut, who you can see here, went to London and has taken back the lock of hair, and you can see what happened with this restitution of the hair. Now, the Battle of Magdala was in 1868, and barely 4 years later, Emperor Johannes made a request to Queen Victoria to return only 2 objects. There were thousands, hundreds of objects which were taken, all kinds of royal regalia, all kinds of manuscripts, maybe over 500 manuscripts, 300 in the British Museum. And he only asked for 2 objects back. He asked for the Kubra Nagast, which is the national epic that justifies the Solomonic dynasty. And he also asked for an icon which the kings of Ethiopia, the Kurator Usu, took into battle. And Queen Victoria wrote back, and they found 2 manuscripts of the Kubra Nagast, and they selected one of them that was possibly the one that had less beautiful pictures in it, but was also the one that had the Book of Aksum, which probably was the reason that Emperor Johannes wanted it, because it had marginalia about Aksum, the church property, and so forth. And it was sent back in 1872. The icon, on the other hand, Queen Victoria wrote that they couldn't find it. Well, actually, it was in the possession of Richard Holmes, who was the British Museum representative that went with the expedition to Magdala. And it's important to note that for the first time, a British expedition had with it, a military expedition, had photographers, had a museum representative, and went with loads of elephants. So this icon of the Christ with the crown of thorns was sold after Holmes's death and is now in a bank vault in Portugal. But the Kubra Nagast has remained in Ethiopia. My mother saw it in 1971. I saw it 2 years ago. It survived the change of regime of power from Tigray to Shoa. It survived the revolution. It survived the Italian occupation. And to this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has kept this manuscript safe in the church of Raguel, first in Ntoto and now in Addis Ababa. And you can actually see on the manuscript the script saying that this was presented by the Secretary of State of India and that this volume was returned to the King of Ethiopia by order of the trustees of the British Museum. So the British Museum trustees back in 1872 did the right thing. They restituted at the request of the emperor, on the suggestion of Queen Victoria, a manuscript. And here you see this very beautiful manuscript preserved through all the difficult times until this day. And often you hear when there are suggestions of restitution and repatriation, well, what happened to things that were restituted before? Well, some objects, artifacts, have survived for a very long time. Others, not so much. So this is the case of a crown. And when Rastafari went to the UK in 1924, he was met by King George, and they wanted, Queen Zoditu was on the throne, and they wanted to give some kind of gesture, some gift. But with the sexist views of the time, they didn't want to give a woman a decoration. And so they thought, well, we have these crowns that were taken, and there was one very beautiful golden one, which remains to this day in the Victoria and Albert, and there was a silver one that seemed to be less precious, and so that was returned and given by the British minister, the ambassador, to Queen Zoditu. And unfortunately, that has since been stolen by the Italians during the Italian occupation. Moving forward, during the imperial period, there were a number of gifts of objects which were restituted. And in 1965, when Queen Elizabeth visited Ethiopia, she came and brought the seal of Emperor Tewodros and the coronet of the Abun that were taken from Magdala. And these objects are now in the Jubilee Palace. I've seen them. This is a very, very beautiful seal with red and green and blue colors and a very nice crown, which I'm not able to show you pictures of, but very soon the Jubilee Palace will be open to the public. Now, it's not just the trustees of the British Museum that did the right thing. There was Emperor Tewodros's Bible that was acquired by the Wellcome Foundation, and you can see here that they decided to return this to Ethiopia and in 1942. When King Theodore's Bible thus came recently to the notice of the Wellcome trustees, it seemed to them inappropriate that its fate and ownership should again be left to the chance of the sale room, and the Foreign Office approved their proposal that it should be offered to the Emperor of Ethiopia, now restored to his throne by armies of the British Empire. So during the imperial period, there were a few items that were returned by the imperial family, the royal family in Britain, to the imperial family in Ethiopia. A new phase of restitution started with Afromet, the Association for the Return of Magdala Ethiopian Treasures, where a number of intellectuals in Ethiopia and in UK set up this association, and some 20 objects were returned, often by descendants of some of the soldiers who realized that these objects had been looted. And this included 2 tabots that one which was discovered in Edinburgh by a priest called Maclachie, and he immediately realized it was a sacred object. And here you see the delegation of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church going to reconsecrate the tabot, which was returned to Ethiopia. And the second one by an Irish doctor called Ian Maclachie, who converted to the Ethiopian Orthodox faith and found this tabot that was being on sale. One of the amulet that Emperor Theodorus had round his neck that was broken by the soldiers who found the body, as well as taking bits of his hair, was returned likewise. And a book of Psalms by Andrew Heavens, who wrote this very important book, which I very strongly recommend to you, that details the story of the plunder, the loot, and Prince Alamayo, who died at the age of 18 in the UK, and which he has a website with a list of objects that were looted from Magdala in 27 museums in the UK and in 9 other countries. Then examples of paintings. These were ripped out of manuscripts by a British lawyer from his great uncle, which is in the Institute of Ethiopian Studies library. And a bit more recently, the family of Lord Napier, who led the expedition, returned a necklace and a scroll, which again are found in the Institute of Ethiopian Studies library. And then most recently, the third phase has been related to auctions. And this started after the 150th anniversary of the Magdala expedition with a conference in Gondar and Debre Tabor. And after that, a committee, a national restitution committee, was set up with people from the different ministries and from the university. And the first successful cancellation of an auction was in 2021, which involved a lot of diplomatic discussion with the Ethiopian embassy in London, and a foundation called the Scheherazade Foundation covered the cost of purchasing the initial, the starting price once the auction had been cancelled. There was a campaign to stop the auction, including several articles in newspapers and in social media, and at the last minute the auction was cancelled. And in particular, these 3 cups that had written on them, taken from Magdala, were returned, and here you see the ceremony organized at a club in London. And these were brought back by Ambassador Teferi in 2021 with a handover ceremony at the Authority for Research and Conservation Cultural Heritage. And this is quite an interesting phenomenon, which is that the soldiers, to give more value to the objects they had looted, and as a kind of trophy, would write on silver onto the objects, showing that this was taken, looted from Magdala, often with the date. And sometimes one of the soldiers or captains would present this to another, as you can see in the case here of the Arbuthnot family. And then coming to the latest one, of course, before our wonderful shield, in 2023, there was a series of restitutions that happened in September, and the art historian Jacopo Nishi came across a collector who had a tabot, and he tried to convince the collector to return it to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and when the collector refused, he negotiated to purchase it himself. And here you see a ceremony at the Mariam Church in London where the tabot was reconsecrated. Some descendants or people who obtained objects and realized that they've been looted also decide to return them, and this was a case of John Lee and his wife, who had a cup taken from Magdala and who returned it, and a very interesting story of a descendant of Captain Speedy, who was the guardian of Prince Alamayo, who found in her father's attic an envelope with two parts of hair, locks of hair, one of Alamayo, aged 9, and the other one of Captain Speedy, and they were in the same envelope. And when she came to the ceremony, the idea was for her to give the lock of hair of Alamayo to go back home to Ethiopia. And then I asked her, well, what are you going to do with Captain Speedy's hair? And she said, well, they were together in life, so maybe the hair should go with Prince Alamayo's hair. So the hair has gone, Captain Speedy's hair has also come back to Ethiopia. Now, moving on to the shields and today's wonderful celebration of this extraordinary gesture by the Royal Ethiopian Trust to decide to purchase this shield for restitution. Now, I just want to point out some features, if I can get the pointer to work, which I don't seem to be able to, but I can do it like this. Because what I want to show you is that when I first started to look at this, I hadn't realized that there are actually quite a few similar shields. Similar but different, and we'll see the differences. But basically what you need to look at, can you hear me? Is that you have rectangular silver plates, and you have these more obelisk or phallic type of does that work? Thank you.
Let's see.
Is that better? Can you hear me? Yeah. So you see you have interspersed, you have these two types, and observe it very carefully with the picture there, and then you have these flower-like with 4 embossments, embossment and then the internal bit, and then above these flowers and these 2 things. Now look at these very carefully, and here again this idea of the trophy, that you write on it the date that gives it value and shows that it is an object that has been taken at the battle. So Magdala, 13th April 1868. This one is a shield, and look how similar it is. This is one that was returned from the Kenya Museum, National Museum, to the National Museum in Addis Ababa, where the shield that the Royal Ethiopian Trust is restituting will be placed. And this is on permanent display. And this was a captain who bought it at the auction. So I should say that I didn't explain properly, but after the looting started and soldiers indiscriminately started to take objects, and the officers stopped them, and all the objects were laid out, and over 3 days there was bidding. And of course Richard Holmes from the British Museum had £1,000 to bid with, so he bought the best objects and got some even before the auction happened. But almost all the officers bought some memento, some souvenir, and the more wealthier captains and generals and in the army bought the more expensive objects. So it's very likely that this was, I think, Levinson bought this, and how exactly it ended up in Kenya is still something I'm trying to discover, and the archivist in the Kenya National Museum is trying to help. This is another one, and you can see again very similar in structure and in decorations. And this was a Scottish professor who inherited this shield, and this was during the Afromet period, and she realized that it was something that had been looted, and she flew to Addis Ababa to return this shield that is in the Institute of Ethiopian Studies Museum at Addis Ababa University. Now, sometimes you find that there is a plaque that is attached to the shield. So here you see one that says "Shield of a Native Chief taken at Magdala in the Abyssinian War by a private of the 33rd Regiment." This is the 33rd Regiment in the assault on Magdala by Captain Trent and presented to Robert Clark. So sometimes the soldiers would then gift this as a trophy of war to a superior or to somebody else, and I think that's a very interesting thing that needs to be understood better. Now, you remember the first one of the Royal Ethiopia Trust had in the middle the writing. Here you find another case where it says Magdala, April 1868, the name Stuart, and the Dragoon, the 3rd Dragoon Guards. And this is a picture of the 3rd Dragoon Guards at the battle. And it's in a private collection where this Michael Graham Stewart has two shields. This one is in the Highland Museum of Scotland. And what's very interesting about this one is that these two inscriptions are actually on the plaques. It's almost as if these were specially made for writing on it. And you see here that taken at Magdala by the British troops, 13th April, and Lieutenant General Sir Patrick Grant from Arbuthnot. So Arbuthnot gives it to a senior person in the army. This character Arbuthnot had actually taken quite a lot of objects, including tabots and others. And you see here a picture of what he called Abyssinian curiosities that has the cross and beakers and cups and swords and so forth. Now, just a few more, and you can see that these are not as similar, but parts missing. Here the center is missing. Here some of the decorations are missing. That one was sold at an auction for £1,000. And this one is in the King's Own Royal Regiment. And you see them over here and saying an Abyssinian soldier's shield. There's one in the Pitts Rivers Museum in Oxford, a very different kind. And Captain Speedy claims that this one belonged to Theodros. And as you can see, very, very different in style. Here's a very plain one that is in the British Museum, but that has charms attached to it. And this one was part of the collection of Richard Holmes, the person that the British Museum sent on the expedition. There are one or two shields that are very, very different in style, and you can see immediately they are not part of the same tradition. And this one, the Dal shield of the Indian subcontinent, and another one that is extremely different that was sold by the sale room in 2021. Now, look at these two, because these are very special. And probably significantly, one is in the British Museum and the other is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And you can see these are very different because they have blue velvet and the decoration work is actually much more sophisticated, and the silver work, the filigree, and the lion's mane that you see on that one. So you can see here the decorations, often with a cross form, so you can see different crosses there, and very finely done decorations. And one of the French travelers, Lejean, mentioned that when Emperor Theodros went into battle, he held an ordinary black shield, but there was a page behind that had the blue velvet shields with the fleur-de-lis designs on them. There's also, of course, a very celebrated shield that Prince Alamayo, the first picture actually in Magdala here, you can see the shield there at the edge. And then when he reached the Isle of Wight in England and met Queen Victoria, there was a very famous photographer, Margaret Cameron, that took a lot of still pictures of him, many of them with Captain Speedy and this shield. And here you see a kind of reenactment of Captain Speedy, and this is a man called Kassa, who was there as somebody who was serving Prince Alamayo. And this is a kind of a set-up kind of scenes, and you see the shield there. So, Emperor Theodoros's shields, or shields, clearly it's quite likely that he had many shields for different purposes. And you can see that this kind of design that we have here is in the frontispiece of the book of the London Illustrated News, where you see a shield that is similar but not absolutely identical to the one that is on exhibit here. But a somewhat similar one, but not identical, is also described as in the costume of the chief in the same London Illustrated News. Now, how did this shield come from Magdala and to the Toledo Museum? What was the journey? Well, the answer is we don't know, but it's a good, there's one guess, and that was that we know that it belonged to the Lambton estate, and Nicholas has done a lot of research on this, and an interesting finding was that the Sir Hedworth, he was one of the Earl of Durham family, and he changed his name to Mew. He changed his name to Mew because there was an actress called Lady Mew, and he distinguished himself in the British campaigns, and she offered him to inherit all her wealth on one condition, that he changed his name. Now, this woman was an extraordinary person. She married a very famous beer producer who died and left her with an enormous fortune, and she then bought an enormous amount of artifacts, mainly from Egypt, but also she bought the most beautiful of the Magdala manuscripts, 5 really, really beautiful manuscripts with extraordinary illustrations. And she loved them so much that she had facsimile representations made of them, of 4 of them, and with the translation done by Wallis Budge, one of the Orientalists, and with annotations. Not many copies, 250. And then Rasmakonnen, on his visit to England in 1902, he saw them, and the story is that he was so moved, he prayed and shed tears and tried to buy them back, begged to have them back, tried to bribe to have them back. And Lady Mew gave him a copy of the reproductions that Emperor Menelik was so impressed by that he wrote her a letter of thanks. And then in her will, she left these manuscripts to Emperor Menelik. But her will was overturned on the grounds that Emperor Menelik had died, which he had not at that particular time. So, here then, Rasmakonnen, in his visit to London in 1902, where does he go? He goes to Westminster Abbey and donates this beautiful silver cross. And here you see a painting of that by an Italian artist. And then later on, Emperor Haile Selassie, when he was Rastafari, he also gives a beautiful ivory cross to Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey is keeping hostage a tabot of a sister church that was donated to the church by Captain Arbuthnot, the captain we saw earlier. And Westminster Abbey comes under, is a royal peculiar, so it comes under the King of England. And so I think this is something where the Royal Ethiopian Trust, and one imperial family, one royal family to another, that has given gifts, 2 generations giving gifts to Westminster Abbey that keeps hidden from the public a sacred icon, a sacred artifact of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Now, the miracles of Mary that was amongst the ones that Lady Mew had inherited are 2 of them have survived. The others have disappeared in auctions. One is in the Shoyan collection, a very, very beautiful one that was bought by the American media mogul, Randolph Hearst, and now has ended up in the Shoyan collection. And then, just as a little bit of a joke between us, the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin has the Miracles of Mary with the St. Mary presenting to Hildephrosis of Toledo, a throne and garment. So here you have the picture of Toledo's successor falling and being smitten by an angel, having touched Mary's gifts, and the people warning him, his successor, against wearing the garment or sitting on the throne. And likewise, in the other example of the miracles of Mary, we have Toledo coming back again, the Spanish Toledo, and that is all I have to